Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, a gentle, sleep-friendly adaptation. Stave I. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead. This must be said at once, plainly, without ornament, like a nail driven into wood. There was no doubt, perhaps, no room for error. The papers were signed. The city spoke briefly, then fell silent, and in Scrooge's life it became just another entry, something not worth feeling. And yet, on winter evenings, when fog settles over the streets like damp wool, when footsteps sound muffled, as though wrapped in thick cloth, death sometimes returns not as a body, but as a cold echo. Above the office door, the sign had hung for years, Scrooge Marley. The letters had darkened with time and smoke, but they had not been removed. Scrooge had no habit of erasing the past. He simply let it remain, like an old signboard, reminding anyone who looked that everything had once been carefully counted. Everyone knew him, and nearly no one loved him. Scrooge was dry, rigid, knotted tight like a rope pulled too hard. His voice always carried something abrasive, as though it could scratch glass. His eyes looked at the world as if the world were always in debt to him. His nose was sharp, his cheeks hollow, his lips thin. It seemed as though a light frost forever rested upon him, not snow from outside, but cold from within. Even when the sun occasionally tried to warm the city, Scrooge carried his own winter in his fingers, his shoulders, in the way he clenched everything to the last coin. And now it was Christmas Eve. Inside the counting house, it was dim, despite the lamp. The light was not festive, only patient and practical. A yellow pool on the desk, long shadows from the pen, dust drifting slowly through the air like fine ash. Outside, the city breathed winter. Fog hung low, and the street lamps shone not forward, but inward, spilling soft, murky halos around themselves. Snow fell lightly and quietly, without joy not decorating the world, but erasing its edges. Somewhere in the courtyard, people rubbed their hands together, searched for warmth in their pockets, stamped their feet against the stones. The sound was dull and weary. The air smelled of wet brick, cold metal, damp wool. Now and then came the scent of coal from chimneys, from stoves, from other people's homes, where someone might already be warming tea or slicing bread. Inside the office, the scent was different. Ink, old paper, dust from ledgers, dry wood, and beneath it all the faint, almost apologetic warmth of the fire, which Scrooge never fed generously. His clerk sat in a narrow alcove like a glass cage. It was even colder there. The fire looked like a single shy coal, afraid to glow too brightly. Even the clerk's fingers moved cautiously as he wrote, as if the cold might snap each letter in half. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle," a voice suddenly called from the doorway. It was was warm, alive, sincere. It carried the breath of the street, frosty, steaming, as though the speaker had just arrived, snowflakes still clinging to his coat. It was Scrooge's nephew. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes bright. He smelled of cold air and motion wind, damp cloth, and something intangible, human warmth. Scrooge did not rise. "Nonsense," he said flatly. "Humbug." The nephew laughed softly, as though hoping humour might melt ice. "Nonsense? Christmas is—" Scrooge turned his head. There was no celebration in his gaze, only calculation. Christmas is a time when people speak foolish words, spend money they do not have, and pretend to be kind. The nephew stood his ground. He spoke of people growing closer, of remembering those who struggle, of hearts opening if only for a moment. The clerk, hearing this, could not help himself. A faint smile flickered. Scrooge noticed at once and crushed it. "One more sound," he said, "and you will celebrate Christmas looking for new employment." The clerk bent over his papers. The nephew sighed. Before leaving, he said gently, "I still wish you happiness and peace and light." Scrooge replied, as if cutting a thread, "Good afternoon." When the nephew left, the air in the office grew colder still, as though warmth itself had been shown the door. Soon after, two gentlemen entered, polite, well-dressed, carrying papers. They spoke of the poor, of charity, of how winter weighs hardest on those with nothing. Scrooge listened, as one listens to rain not from interest, but because it falls regardless. "Are there not prisons?" he asked. "Are there not workhouses? Let them go there." He refused them firmly, without shame, and when they departed, Scrooge felt the satisfaction of a man who believed he had acted correctly. Outside, dusk thickened. Fog crept into cracks and corners, softening the world and making it more frightening, for softness hides things. At last, closing time came. Scrooge put on his coat. The fabric was coarse, heavy, cold to the touch like the skin of an old world. He buttoned it to his chin, as always, as though shielding himself from any human weakness. The clerk reached for his hat. Scrooge grudgingly allowed the next day off, not as a holiday, but as an inconvenience. And then he left. His dinner was as usual, plain, silent, without joy. Afterward came the newspaper, the ledgers, the numbers. The rustle of pages sounded like dry leaves. The words offered no warmth. Then he went home. The building was old and dark. The courtyard was narrow, like the neck of a bottle clogged with fog. The stones underfoot were slick and cold. Even the air smelled different here. Whetstone, aged wood, long closed doors. Scrooge reached the door and took out his key. And then he saw it. The knocker. large, ordinary knocker. Except it was not a knocker. For a single moment, just one, it became Marley's face. Not a resemblance, not a suggestion. The face itself, the cold stare, the unmoving eyes, the shadow of spectacles, as though fog and frost had shaped it solely to look at Scrooge. Something heavy settled in his chest. Not fear, not yet. More a sense that the solid ground of reason had slipped away. The next instant, it was only a knocker again. Scrooge exhaled sharply, as though forcing the thought aside. "Nonsense," he muttered, turning the key. Inside was darkness. The silence was thick, like cloth. He lit a candle, and at once the room filled with the warm, sweet scent of wax, so domestic it felt almost offensive. The flame trembled. Light slid along walls and furniture, revealing dust on shelves, forgotten corners, places untouched by laughter for years. He shut the door. The lock sounded heavy and metallic, like the lid of a chest snapping closed. He climbed the stairs, step by step, slowly, carefully, as always. In his room, he checked everything, under the table, beneath the bed, behind the curtains, as if his mind already knew something was wrong. Then he sat by the fire. The flames were weak but alive. The smell was familiar: smoke, ash, warm iron. And then he heard a sound. At first, barely there. Somewhere above, an old bell began to sway. No wind, no cause. The ring was thin and metallic, like ice cracking on water. Then there were more bells, as though the whole house had found a voice. And then another sound, lower, heavier, as though a chain were being dragged across stone. It was coming closer, slowly, unavoidably. Scrooge gripped the arms of his chair until his fingers turned white. The door did not open. It simply ceased to be a barrier. And Marley entered the room. He looked as he had in life, and not. The clothes were familiar, but the body transparent, as though made of cold glass. The candlelight passed through him, and the calmness of it was terrifying. And most of all, the chain. It wrapped around his body and trailed heavily to the floor. Its links were not ornaments, but objects: keys, locks, ledgers, steel cash boxes, heavy purses, everything they had lived for. The sound of the chain sank into bone. Marley looked at Scrooge. The expression was not angry. It was tired. "You do not believe in me," said the ghost. Scrooge tried to answer sharply. His voice came out dry and brittle. "No?" Marley tilted his head. The air grew colder. The scent of wax mixed with something else, metal, dampness, emptiness, like a long-abandoned cellar. "I have come to warn you," said the spirit. "Of what?" "So that you do not become me." And then he spoke the truth. 3 spirits would visit Scrooge. The first tomorrow, when the bell struck 1. The second, the following night. The third, on the night after that, at the stroke of midnight. Scrooge swallowed. The air felt thick, as though fog and ash had been stirred together. I would rather not. Marley swayed beneath the weight of his chain. Without them, you cannot escape what awaits you. He raised his hand, and suddenly the air filled with voices, distant, sorrowful, as though souls were crying without mouths. Scrooge moved to the window, not because he wished to, but because he could not stop himself. Beyond the glass was darkness. The lamps smeared their light across the fog, and within it he saw shadows, phantoms. They wandered, restless, searching for someone they might still help, but were forever forbidden to touch. Many bore chains like Marley's. They moaned, not in pain, but in regret for the good they might have done, and never did. Marley slowly retreated toward the window and vanished into the cold night. Scrooge stood there long after, gripping the frame. The wood was icy and rough. A fine layer of dust clung to his fingers, proof that the world was still real. He closed the window, checked the locks twice, and without undressing, lay down on the bed. The candle burned out, leaving behind the scent of warm wax so cozy it felt like an insult. Scrooge closed his eyes and fell asleep at once like a man afraid to wake.